Picture this. You are sitting at your kitchen table, staring down just a massive, intimidating stack of legal paperwork.
Oh, yeah, we've all been there.
Right. Your pen is hovering over the signature line, and I mean, all you want is the set of keys to your new apartment, but standing between you and that front door is like 30-plus pages of dense, tiny text.
It's exhausting.
It really is. And if you are like most people, you probably treat a lease exactly like the terms and conditions on a software update. You just, scroll to the bottom, let out a deep sigh, and sign it without reading a single word.
Yeah, and, well, it is entirely understandable why people do that. I mean, the language is dense, the print is so small, and you're usually in a rush to just start packing boxes. But ignoring that text is actually a massive missed opportunity.
Which is exactly why we are flipping the script for today's deep dive. We are unpacking a stack of sources that govern how you literally live. We've got the official 2026 Cook County Residential Lease, the that's the Residential Tenant Landlord Ordinance, the Illinois Safe Homes Act, and believe it or not, an official EPA guide on bed bugs.
Yeah, the bed bug guide is literally woven into the lease itself now.
It's wild. So our mission today is to decode all this legalese and extract the crucial insights, because this document, it isn't just a list of rules telling you what you can't do.
Far from it. When you actually look at the mechanics of these documents, they reveal a really profound shift in local power dynamics.
Yeah.
Over the last several years leading up to these 2026 regulations, lawmakers have deliberately restructured these agreements.
To equalize the playing field, right?
Exactly, to equalize things between landlords and renters. So what you are actually signing is a highly specific, legally binding set of tools designed to protect your safety and your financial security. The problem is most tenants just have no idea these tools even exist.
Well, let's change that right now. I want you, the listener, to think of this lease less like a list of chores and more like a mutual defense treaty. And I want to start with your first line of defense, which is your wallet.
Naturally.
Because historically, moving into a new place meant handing over a small fortune and just, hoping you'd see some of it again a year later. So how does this new 2026 framework actually change that financial tightrope?
Well, it creates strict guardrails, starting with the security deposit. A landlord can no longer just ask for whatever exorbitant sum they feel like to hedge their bets against you.
Right.
The law now strictly caps the security deposit at 1.5 times the monthly rent, period.
Wait, let me make sure I'm doing the math right here. If my rent is $2,000 a month, they can ask for $3,000 upfront.
That's right.
I mean, that is still a massive hit to someone's bank account on moving day, especially when you're paying the first month's rent on top of it.
It is, yeah, and lawmakers recognize that exact burden. That is why they engineered a very specific mechanism into the lease. If a landlord decides to charge that maximum 1.5 times the rent, the law provides the tenant with an automatic installment plan loophole.
Oh, really?
Yeah. You do not have to hand over that excess half-month amount on day one. You legally have up to 6 months to pay that specific overage in installments.
Okay, that is a huge breathing room for a renter. But what happens once the landlord actually has my $3,000? Do they just toss it into their personal checking account and use it to buy groceries until I move out?
No. Absolutely not. The banking regulations here are incredibly fierce. Your deposit must be held in a federally insured financial institution located specifically in Illinois.
Okay.
And furthermore, it has to be completely segregated from the landlord's personal or operational funds. They cannot commingle the money at all.
So the money is guarded while I live there. But, the real friction always happens when it's time to move out.
How does the lease handle the classic scenario where a landlord tries to nickel and dime you for damages?
It handles it by imposing a very loud, very fast ticking clock. The landlord has exactly 30 days to return your deposit.
30 days?
Right. And if they want to make deductions for damages, and this is crucial, it has to be beyond normal wear and tear. They cannot just invent a number. They are legally required to provide you with an itemized statement alongside actual paid receipts for the materials and labor.
All within that 30-day window.
Exactly.
I'm curious about the everyday penalties, too. Let's say I have an unexpected medical bill, and I'm like 3 days late on rent.
Yeah.
I've had friends in the past who got hit with a $100 late fee for being just 2 days late, which just spirals their debt.
Yeah, that debt spiral is exactly what the law is trying to eliminate. Under the current rules, late fees are heavily capped.
How so?
The formula is extremely rigid. A landlord can only charge you a maximum of $10 for the first $1,000 of your rent. Okay.
And if your rent is higher than $1,000, they can only charge an additional 5% on the amount that exceeds that first $1,000.
Okay, so they can't just punish you into poverty. But knowing how industries work, I have to assume landlords try to find workarounds. Like, what's stopping them from just calling the security deposit a non-refundable move-in fee and bypassing all these banking rules entirely?
Well, they certainly tried that for a long time.
I bet.
But the new framework cracks down on that loophole hard. A move-in fee can no longer just be a renamed deposit. It has to reflect actual, estimated out-of-pocket costs that the landlord incurs because of your move.
Like what?
We're talking about very specific line items like reserving a freight elevator, changing the directory, processing mailbox identification, or paying for extra trash removal. They have to be able to show their math.
And what if they don't? Let's say a landlord slips up, they put the deposit in the wrong bank, or they miss that 30-day window to send the receipts. What is the actual consequence?
This is where the power dynamic truly flips. If a landlord violates these deposit rules, the tenant can sue them for double the security deposit amount, plus the tenant's attorney fees.
Wow, wait, that sounds like a financial tripwire. Like one simple clerical error putting the money in a bank across the border in Indiana instead of Illinois, and boom, they owe double. It almost seems overly punitive. Why make the penalty so severe?
It's deliberately severe because of the history of the industry. For decades, it was just too difficult for a tenant to prove a landlord had malicious intent when they kept a deposit. So lawmakers made it a strict liability standard.
I see.
The severity forces systemic compliance. It forces massive corporate landlords and small mom-and-pop owners alike to completely professionalize their accounting. By making the penalty financially painful, it eliminates the old, lazy tactic of just keeping a deposit by default and daring the tenant to hire a lawyer.
Because now the tenant's lawyer is paid for by the landlord if the tenant wins. That is a brilliant mechanism. Okay, so we've established that the lease heavily defends your wallet. But transitioning through these sources, it's very clear that this document is also fundamentally about having control over your physical environment. The Illinois Safe Homes Act summary, for instance, is legally required to be attached right at the front of the lease.
Yes, and it is arguably the most vital lifeline in the entire document. The Safe Homes Act provides explicit, non-negotiable protections for survivors of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking.
Let's break down how it actually works in practice. First, I noticed there are strict rules around impartial reporting. A landlord cannot evict you purely because you are a victim of these crimes or because someone directed criminal activity at your apartment.
Right, which is incredibly important when you look at how local governments used to operate. In the past, many municipalities had these nuisance ordinances.
Oh, right.
Yeah, if the police were called to a specific address too many times, the town would fine the landlord, and the landlord would then just evict the tenant to stop the fines.
That's terrible. It creates a chilling effect where victims are terrified to call 911.
Exactly. The Safe Homes Act explicitly bans local municipalities from penalizing tenants or landlords for calling emergency services for these situations.
Taking away that fear of eviction is just huge. But what if staying in the apartment simply isn't an option anymore?
Then the lease essentially functions as an emergency escape hatch.
Yeah.
If you are under an imminent threat of domestic or sexual violence, you have the legal right to break your lease early, and you will not be held responsible for any future rent.
Wow.
The mechanism is straightforward. You just have to give written notice within 3 days before or after you leave the property.
And reading through this, there's also a specific provision for sexual violence that happens on the premises, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
If sexual violence occurs on the property, the tenant has a 60-day window to utilize this escape hatch. The law even allows for flexibility beyond that 60 days if, say, medical or other extreme circumstances prevented the tenant from notifying the landlord sooner.
That's incredible. But what if you want to stay in your home and you just need to keep the abuser out?
You have the right to demand the locks be changed. You provide the landlord with 48 hours notice, along with supporting evidence which could be medical records, a police report, or a statement from a victim services organization.
Okay.
And here's where the law gives the tenant direct agency. If the landlord fails to change those locks within that 48-hour window, you can legally hire a locksmith, change the locks yourself, and just hand the landlord the new key.
Wow. That is direct empowerment right there. And there are privacy protections tied to this as well, correct? If I use this law, can my current landlord tell my future landlord that I broke my lease?
Absolutely not. If a landlord discloses that you used the Safe Homes Act to a prospective landlord, they face a strict privacy penalty. They're liable to pay you up to $2,000 in actual damages, plus your attorney's fees.
That's serious.
Yeah, and the ecosystem even extends beyond the landlord. Utility companies are legally required to defer initial credit and deposit requirements for 60 days for victims, ensuring they can actually get the lights turned on in their new safe location.
It is a remarkably comprehensive safety net. But I do have to play devil's advocate on the logistics here for a second. What happens if the person posing the threat is a roommate who is also signed on the lease?
Oh, yeah.
How does a landlord legally change the locks on someone who has a binding contract to live there?
That is one of the most complex scenarios a property owner can face. But the law actually anticipates this exact friction. If the abuser is a co-tenant, you cannot just hand the landlord a doctor's note and demand your roommate be locked out.
Because that would violate the roommate's contract rights.
Exactly. Instead, the victim must provide what is called a plenary order of protection, or a civil no-contact order.
Let's clarify that for everyone. A plenary order of protection isn't just a quick police report, is it?
No, not at all. A plenary order of protection is a long-term restraining order issued by a judge,
Right.
but only after a full court hearing where evidence is presented and evaluated.
Ah, I see.
By requiring this specific legal document, the law carefully balances contract rights against human safety. It takes the liability off the landlord's shoulders and places the decision in the hands of the judicial system, which then grants the victim exclusive possession of the residence.
That makes perfect sense. It requires a judge to untangle the competing rights. So escaping a genuinely dangerous, violent situation is one extreme of controlling your physical environment. But let's talk about the day-to-day livability. What happens when the apartment just starts falling apart?
Right, that brings us to the legal concept of habitability and the tenant's right to self-help remedies.
Let's start with the absolute baseline. Staying in the unit, the sources highlight anti-lockout laws. There are no exceptions here, right?
None whatsoever. A landlord cannot engage in any form of self-help eviction. They cannot cut off your electricity, they cannot take your front door off its hinges, and they certainly cannot change your locks to force you out.
Regardless of how far behind you are on rent.
Exactly. If they attempt any of this, you can sue to regain entry, recover your attorney's fees, and collect either 2 months' rent or twice your actual damages. It forces every single dispute through the formal legal eviction process.
So vigilante justice from the landlord is completely off the table. But what about, vigilante maintenance from the tenant? If my cabinet door falls off and the landlord just ignores my emails, can I just fix it and send them the bill?
Under specific conditions, yes. If it is a minor repair, you must first give the landlord written notice. If they ignore that notice for 14 days, you can hire a professional or fix it yourself.
Just like that.
Well, as long as the repair costs under $500, or half of your monthly rent, whichever is less, you can legally deduct that exact cost from your next rent payment, provided you hand over the receipts.
But what if it isn't a cabinet door? What if it's January in Chicago and my heater completely dies?
When it comes to essential services, heat, running water, electricity, gas, plumbing, the timeline shrinks dramatically. You don't have to wait 2 weeks freezing in your living room.
Thank goodness.
After providing written notice of a lack of essential services, if it is not fixed within 24 hours, you have powerful options.
Like what can a tenant actually do after just 24 hours?
You can start deducting rent to reflect the diminished value of the apartment. Or you can procure substitute housing, literally go book a hotel room, and the landlord is legally obligated to cover that cost.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and if the situation drags on and 72 hours pass without those essential services being restored, the tenant can terminate the lease entirely and move out within 30 days.
We have to talk about the bedbug rules, too, because this blew my mind. An official federal EPA guide is mandated to be attached to a local county lease.
It really highlights just how destructive and difficult bedbugs are to manage in multi-unit buildings. The timelines here are incredibly aggressive for both parties.
Yeah, if a tenant spots a bedbug, they have a strict 48-hour window to notify the landlord in writing. And once they do, the landlord has 10 days to bring in a professional pest control service. But what fascinated me is the specific methodology required.
Right, the integrated pest management.
Exactly. The EPA guide demands it. Why can't a landlord just send someone in with a can of chemical spray?
Because the biology of the insect renders that ineffective. Bed bugs have developed thick exoskeletons and severe resistance to standard chemical pesticides over the decades. Spraying them often just causes them to scatter into neighboring units.
Which still makes it worse.
Right. Integrated Pest Management, or IPM, recognizes this. It requires a mechanical approach, using industrial vacuums to physically remove them utilizing high-heat treatments to destroy the eggs, encasing mattresses, and permanently sealing cracks in the walls.
Sounds intense.
It is an expensive, exhaustive process, and the lease legally binds the landlord to execute it.
I have to ask, though, hearing all of this, deducting rent, charging landlords for hotels, breaking leases in 72 hours, it almost sounds like a tenant could just declare a rent strike the minute a pipe makes a funny noise. How does the system prevent a tenant from abusing these rules?
The law is very carefully constructed to prevent that. The burden of proof is heavily shared. A tenant cannot exercise any of these self-help remedies if they, their family members, or their guests caused the damage or the utility outage.
Ah, so you can't deliberately break your own radiator on a Friday and demand a luxury hotel stay on Saturday?
Exactly. And furthermore, all of this requires a documented paper trail. You can't just make a phone call. You must provide written notices and valid receipts. But conversely, if a tenant does follow the rules, say, they complain to a government agency about the lack of heat, or they join a tenant union, or talk to a local news station, the law provides massive retaliation protection.
How so?
A landlord cannot suddenly raise your rent, decrease your services, or threaten you with eviction just because you exercised your rights. If they attempt any of those actions within 1 year of your complaint, the court operates under the legal presumption that it is retaliation.
Wow, a full year presumption.
Yeah. The landlord would have to prove a legitimate, alternative reason for their actions. It demands that both sides act like professionals.
Control over the environment clearly goes both ways. But so far, we've only talked about things you can see or feel, right? Broken locks, missing heat, bugs. One of the most surprising parts of these sources is how the 2026 lease requirements force landlords to reveal the invisible hazards haunting a property before you even move in.
Right, the mandatory environmental and situational disclosures. This is where the burden of due diligence fundamentally shifts.
Let's walk through them. First, the classic one. Landlords must disclose the presence of known lead-based paint if the building was constructed prior to 1978. But the one that really stood out to me was radon. Landlords have to provide a disclosure if radon gas levels are known to be at or above 4.0 picocuries per liter. What does that measurement actually mean for someone living there?
Well, radon is a naturally occurring radioactive gas that seeps up from the soil into basements and lower floors. It is completely invisible and odorless. The EPA has set the action level at 4.0 picocuries per liter because, at that concentration, the risk of developing lung cancer is roughly equivalent to smoking half a pack of cigarettes every single day.
That is terrifying.
It is the leading cause of lung cancer in non-smokers. By forcing this disclosure, the law prevents landlords from renting out a silent hazard.
And speaking of lower-level floors, the flood disclosures are incredibly specific now, too.
Yes, driven largely by changing climate patterns and extreme weather. If you are renting a lower-level unit, which generally means a basement or a ground-floor apartment, the landlord must disclose two things.
Okay, what are they?
First, if the property is located in a FEMA-designated 100-year floodplain. And second, regardless of FEMA, they must disclose if that specific unit has flooded at all in the past 10 years.
And the lease actually goes out of its way to warn the tenant about insurance, right?
It does. It explicitly warns tenants that standard renters insurance policies rarely cover groundwater flood damage. You generally have to buy a separate policy. This disclosure prevents a tenant from moving all their belongings into a basement unit, only to lose everything in a heavy spring rainstorm.
They also have to disclose financial instability. Like, if the property is currently subject to foreclosure litigation, the landlord must formally hand you a disclosure stating that fact before you sign.
Because you have a right to know if the building you're moving into might be repossessed by a bank halfway through your lease.
That makes perfect sense. There's also a major rule regarding timelines at the end of the lease, the 60-day non-renewal rule. A landlord can't just pop their head in a week before your lease ends and tell you to pack up.
No, absolutely not. They must give you 60 days written notice if they intend to terminate your tenancy or not renew your lease.
And what if they forget? What leverage does the tenant have?
Incredible leverage. If the landlord fails to give that proper 60 days notice, the tenant secures the legal right to remain in the apartment for up to 120 days after the notice is finally provided.
Wow.
And they get to stay under the exact same terms and the exact same rent. It ensures you cannot be rushed out of your home into a frantic housing search.
But the rules also cover the inverse scenario. What happens if the tenant is the one who completely vanishes?
The abandonment clauses. If a tenant disappears for 32 days without paying rent, and the landlord has reasonable evidence to believe the unit is abandoned, the landlord can enter and clear the unit. But the property left behind is strictly categorized by its objective worth.
Right. If the items are deemed valueless, the landlord can simply throw them in the trash after 7 days without giving notice. But if the items have value, the landlord is required to safely store them, give the tenant 7 days written notice, and then sell the items, holding the proceeds for the tenant for an entire year.
Which brings us back to the core theme. Even when the tenancy completely falls apart and the apartment is abandoned, the law imposes strict, regulated procedures.
So let's wrap this up. We started this deep dive looking at a daunting, overwhelming stack of legal paperwork sitting on a kitchen table. But by unpacking the mechanics, we've found that a modern lease is far more than just a monthly bill.
It is a highly regulated, finely tuned ecosystem.
It is an ecosystem that caps your financial penalties, stops landlords from treating your security deposit like a slush fund, and actively prevents predatory debt spirals. It provides literal, legally protected escape routes for victims of violence and domestic abuse. It empowers you to fix your own heating or demand a hotel if the landlord ignores you. And it forces the disclosure of invisible ghosts, from radioactive gas to looming bank foreclosures, before you ever unpack a single box.
So the next time you handed a 30-page lease, don't just sigh and blindly sign at the bottom.
Read it. Recognize the absolute power you hold within those pages. It is your legally binding right to a habitable, safe, and transparently managed home. But, as we close out today's dive into the sources, there is one detail that I just cannot stop thinking about.
The abandonment clause?
Yes. The entire mechanism of what happens to an abandoned apartment hinges on whether the items left behind have value or are valueless. It allows a landlord to literally throw away valueless items in a dumpster after just 7 days. But in an increasingly digital and sentimental world, who gets to act as the ultimate arbiter of what value actually means?
It is an incredibly subjective standard to codify into a binding legal contract.
What if a tenant's most prized, irreplaceable possession, a stack of handwritten letters from a late grandparent, a child's finger painting, a family photo album, is financially worthless to a landlord trying to quickly turn over a unit for the next renter? It leaves you to wonder if future iterations of these leases will need entirely new, highly complex clauses just to define the subjective, emotional worth of the things we leave behind. Something to chew on the next time you're sitting at that kitchen table, your pen hovering over the paper.